Although every cell in your body changes such that you are never again the same person physically, and your neural networks change every hour of your life as you absorb new experiences, why do you have an illusion of consistency as though you're the same person you were a week ago or a year ago? What does this have to do with the mythical watercraft of the Greek demigod Theseus? What is the end of history illusion? And why do you go through so much trouble to make things comfortable for your future self, even though you don't know that person? And you can be guaranteed that that person is not going to feel the same way you do now. And if there were an afterlife, what age would your deity dial you to for living out eternity? Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist and an author at Stanford. And in these episodes, we dive deeply into our 3-pound universe to uncover some of the most surprising aspects of our lives. Today, we're going to talk about the notion of having a self and what that has to do with our memory. And this is a big topic, so we're going to do this in 2 parts. Today, we're going to talk about how and why we think of ourselves as lasting through time and what that has to do with our memories. And in next week's episode, part 2, I'm going to talk with my colleague, neuroscientist Michael Levin, one of the most energized and original thinkers in the field. And I'm going to talk with him about the way in which memories can be thought of like little creatures of their own that carry messages in a bottle from one version of you to the next. So for today, let's start in ancient Greece, where the historian Plutarch wrote about a tough puzzle that had been floating around in the Greek philosopher circles, and they were all arguing about it. The puzzle was this. Imagine the ship of Theseus. Theseus was the hero in Greek mythology who slayed the Minotaur. The idea is that Theseus and his crew of Athenians sail back from Crete and dock his wonderful ship. But then the ship sits in harbor for a long time, and one of the planks starts to rot, so it gets replaced with new and stronger timber. And then that happens with another plank on the ship, and another. And eventually, with enough time, the entire ship gets replaced, meaning that not a single plank is the same as what it was when the ship first docked. And the question is it the same ship of Theseus? Or is it not his ship anymore because every single part has been replaced? Plutarch suggested that half the philosophers in Greece argued the ship is still the same ship because it retains its identity despite the changes to its parts. And the other half of philosophers, he suggested, argued that the ship is not the same ship because no part of it is the same. So, for thousands of years, the ship of Theseus has been a thought experiment that surfaces these tough questions about identity and change. By the way, there are lots of variants on this. My father had an axe in the garage, and he would always hold it up and tell me, this was actually George Washington's axe. Oh, but the handle has been replaced 12 times, and the axe head has been replaced 14 times. It was obviously a joke, but it got me thinking from a young age about the nature of identity in the face of change. Does something retain its identity if all the parts change? Now, why would a neuroscience podcast care about the ship of Theseus or George Washington's axe? It's because that kind of wholesale replacement is precisely what's happening to your brain and your entire body. A big part of the mystery of selfhood has to do with the fact that all the pieces and parts that make up you are constantly turning over. Your body is built out of 30 trillion cells, and this is just cellular stuff. Every bit of the cells has a lifetime. Most of the cells die or subdivide at some point, but even those cells that stick around your whole life and don't divide, like your neurons, they're totally different every few years. Why? Because brain cells aren't made out of something stable like metal or cement. Instead, they're made out of the basic proteins and lipids and other molecules that make up any cell in the body. And those things aren't particularly stable. So every single neuron and every cell in your body is like the ship of Theseus. Every part of it is getting rebuilt all the time, one plank at a time, or in this case, one molecule at a time. The pieces and parts of the cell have no meaningful stability. And so a big part of all that cellular machinery is simply building and rebuilding and rebuilding. And in this way, everything gets replaced. So who you are physically changes all the time. And the question is, how does your self stay intact over this changing substrate? The answer is, it's not clear that it does. But cognitively, you have this illusion of stability. You are one being. You've spent your whole life with a fixed history, as in, I grew up here. Here's my name. This was my hometown. These were my parents. This is how my trajectory in life has unfolded, leading me from here to there to there. And so we tend to hold the impression that our identities are something very stable. But in fact, who you are drifts. In this light, it's always struck me as funny to think about the notion of an afterlife, because what age would you be? Depending on when you get there, you might be a very different person than you were even 5 years before that. And so all this inspired me to write a short story that's published in my book, Sum, S-U-M. And I'm going to read that story to illustrate the questions of this episode. The story is called Prism. God resolved at the outset that he wanted every human to participate in the afterlife. But the plans weren't thought out to completion, and immediately he began to run up against some confusion about age. How old should each person be in the afterlife? Should this grandmother exist here at her age of death? Or should she be allowed to live as a young woman, recognizable to her first lover, but not to her granddaughter? He decided it was unfair to keep people the age they were at the end of their lives, when much of their beauty and alacrity had been worn down. Allowing everyone to live as a young adult proved an unviable solution, because the afterlife quickly degenerated into unbounded sexual pursuits. And at Middle Ages, they talked only about their children and mortgages, making conversations in the afterlife tedious. God finally landed on an ingenious solution while watching light diffract through a prism. So when you arrive here, you are split into your multiple selves at all possible ages. The you that existed as a single identity is now all ages at once. These pieces of you no longer get old, but remain ageless into perpetuity. The yous have transcended time. This takes some getting used to. The different beams of you might run into each other at the grocery store, like separate people do in Earth life. Your 76-year-old self may revisit his favorite creek and run into your 11-year-old self. Your 28-year-old self may break up with a lover in a diner and notice your 35-year-old self visiting that spot, lingering on the air of regret hanging over the empty seat. Typically, the different yous are happy to see each other because they possess the same name and a shared history. But the yous are more critical of yourselves than they are of others. And so each you quickly identifies habits that get under your skin. It's a fact of the afterlife. Don't be surprised to discover that after decomposition into your different ages, the different yous tend to drift apart. You discover that the you of 8 years old has less in common than expected with the you of 32 and the you of 64. The 18-year-old you finds more in common with other 18-year-olds than with your 73-year-old you. The 73-year-old you doesn't mind a bit seeking out meaningful conversations with others of the same generation. Beyond the name, the yous have little else in common. But don't lose hope. The shared resume of life, parents, birthplace, hometown, school years, first kiss, has a magnetic, nostalgic pull. So once in a while, the different yous organize a gathering, like a family reunion, bringing together all your ages into a single room. At these reunions, the middle-aged will delightedly pinch the cheeks of the young, and the teenagers will politely listen to the stories and advice of the elderly. These reunions reveal a group of individuals touchingly searching for a common theme. They appeal to your name as a unifying structure, but they come to realize that the name that existed on Earth, the you that moved serially through these different identities, was like a bundle of sticks from different trees. They come to understand with awe the complexity of the compound identity that existed on the Earth. They conclude with a shudder that the earthly you is utterly lost, unpreserved in the afterlife. You were all these ages, they concede, and you were none. So we're changing all the time, but why is it hard to keep track of these changes? Obviously, it's because everything in our lives and our biology changes so slowly. It's like the hour hand of a clock. You can see that it's moved, but you can't see it move. In general, we can see change most readily in the growth of our children. You look back at photographs from a year ago on your phone, and you can't believe how much things have changed, but it's hard to keep track of the changes in yourself. A friend of my parents went to his high school reunion, which was taking place at a hotel, and he went around looking at the different conference rooms to figure out which one was the correct class because they were divided up by decades. And he thought he found the right room, but he popped his head in and he realized that's completely not the right room. All of those are very old people. And then he stepped back and looked at the sign and realized that indeed this was the correct room. And he too must presumably look that old to others, even if he still thought of himself as young on the inside. So it's hard to keep track of our own changes because they happen slowly. But maybe the thing that binds your self together across the ever-changing physical substrate is the one thing you have that remains constant, your memory. Memory ties all these versions of you together. Memory serves as the thread that weaves through all these transformations, anchoring a sense of self. So that sounds very nice, but there's a fundamental problem with this, which is that memory itself is not stable. It drifts. And I've talked about this in several episodes. Memory is not a faithful, unchanging record of the past. It's instead a fragile brain state, and it needs to be reactivated and reconstructed each time you recall it. And in this process, memories morph. So we can't really think of them as an archive. They're more of a story which we continually rewrite. And that would be fine to keep rewriting a story, except that we assume at all times that our memories form the core of a stable identity. So let me give an example of how memories change. Imagine that you and two friends were at some rooftop party and you were best friends since college, and the night was full of jokes and old stories, and you remember feeling grateful for this bond that you shared, and you can still picture the three of you by the fireplace vowing to never let life pull you apart. But now, a year later, everything has changed. Those two guys are now enemies. It all fell apart because one of them had an affair with the other's girlfriend. So now when you think back on that rooftop party, you wonder, was there something in the way he and the other guy's girlfriend exchanged glances across the room? You now think you sort of remember there were little stolen looks. There was some subtle tension in the air. Did your other friend sense that something was funny even then? The memory that once felt warm and comforting now feels different, like a scene in a movie that you're watching for the second time, but noticing new things. Now, the past hasn't changed, but your present knowledge of what came after that party colors the memory and reshapes it. And it makes you question what was really there and what you've unconsciously added. Memory is slippery like that. The more you revisit it, the more it shifts and blurs. Which reminds me of a great quotation from Sigmund Freud on this topic. In 1896, he wrote a letter to a colleague about, quote, the material present in the form of memory traces being subjected from time to time to a rearrangement in accordance with fresh circumstances, to a retranscription. And there's another quotation that I cite often from a writer named John Dufresne, who once wrote that, quote, "Memory is a myth-making machine. What we do is keep revising our past to keep it consistent with who we think we are." So here's where we are so far. Our biology is always changing, and so the thing that crosses time is our memory, but even that changes all the time, drifting or warping or disintegrating altogether. And as a result, who you are is always on the move. Now, I've been speaking as though we're not always aware of so much change happening over time, but of course we can come to be aware of this in some circumstances. For example, when you look back at a diary entry that you wrote some years ago, it's often surprising how much you've changed, how much the person who held that pen is a bit different than who you are now. So we do confront this sometimes. But what's weird is despite the massive changes that happen in our past, we always think that there will be little change in the future. We've changed a lot up until now, but now we've settled into place and there won't be much change from here. And this is a cognitive illusion known as the end of history illusion. In other words, we can recognize significant changes in ourselves when we think about our past, but we underestimate how much we're going to change in the future. We acknowledge that we've grown or evolved, but we incorrectly assume that who we are right now is pretty close to our final or mature version of ourselves. This end of history illusion was first studied by psychologists like Daniel Gilbert and his colleagues, and they surveyed people on their values and their preferences, their personality traits, their life goals, and across the board, they found that people consistently believe that they've undergone more change in the past than they will in the future. But of course, it's an illusion because change is a continuous process. In other words, if I ask you now if you've essentially finished changing in life, if your likes and personality have settled, you'll say, yeah. But if I track you down and ask you again in 5 years, you'll say, actually, the past 5 years did hold a lot of change for me, but now I've finally arrived at my stable self. And it's the same story if I survey you 5 years after that. And this is problematic because, for example, we're always trying to predict our future emotions. You think, oh, if I get that job promotion, or if I'm in this relationship, or if I have kids, or if I don't have kids, this will make me really happy. Or if I lose this job and I have to find a new one, that's going to make me miserable. This is what psychologists call affective forecasting, where we project how we think we're going to feel. But it's based on your current limited knowledge about the world, and that might change. So why do we have an end of history illusion? Well, presumably it's because it's easier for us to see the past changes because we have memories and experiences to draw from, but future changes are hidden in the mists of the future. We don't know what they are. So let me give you some concrete examples of this. Think about the way we have our career goals. As a 30-year-old, you might look back and realize your career aspirations have changed, maybe significantly from the time you were 20. But you might assume that your current career goals are unlikely to change much in the next 10 years, even though lots of people shift career paths or professional interests throughout life. Or think about your music preferences. If you're older, you may recognize that your taste in music has evolved since your teenage years. Maybe you went from pop or rock to maybe jazz or classical. But despite that, you're likely to believe that your current musical preferences are going to remain stable for the rest of your life, even though your musical tastes are going to keep evolving with exposure to new genres and bands and instruments that don't even exist yet. Or think about friendships. In your early 20s, you might reflect on how your circle of friends has changed from high school to college. There's a big shift in relationships there. But you might simultaneously feel certain that the college friends you have now are going to be your closest companions for life. That's a totally understandable position, but it underestimates how friendships shift as you enter different life stages, like when you start a family or you move to a new city. The same reasoning applies to everything. So take hobbies and interests. When you're in your 50s, you notice that you've taken up new hobbies and given up old ones over the years, but you'll generally believe that your current interests will remain consistent for the coming decades, when in fact, New hobbies and interests will still emerge. You just can't see that because they're ensconced in the dark forest of the future. Possibly there's some new technology that you're going to be obsessed with that hasn't even been invented or named yet. Okay, and the one that's really hard for us to admit to is future changes in our political values and social beliefs and possibly religious beliefs. When you look back on any of your beliefs from a decade ago, you can sometimes see there have been some changes. But again, we tend to assume that our current values are now locked into place for the rest of our lives. We all fail to anticipate that our worldview is going to continue to get reshaped by life experiences, by new information, by changing social contexts. In a decade, we might not be precisely who we are right now. Now, this whole end of history illusion wouldn't really matter for our lives, except that it affects how we make decisions, because so much of what you do is in service to the assumed future you. You suffer through courses and trainings now to make things better for your future you. You sweat through a workout so your future you will have a better body. You put your money into retirement plans to make sure that the future you has the resources that you predict that stranger will need. The difficulty simply is that we're not good predictors. You don't really know who that person is. That person shares your name and your history, but the fact is that person might be very different than the current you. So you're donating your retirement money for this future person that you can essentially guarantee will be not who you currently believe. That person might vote for the other political party, the one you would never vote for, and yet you're slaving away and handing over all your money to that maniac. And you also do stuff assuming the best about your future self, but sometimes that's not useful either. We tend to assume that our future self will be more motivated or disciplined than we are today. So because of that, you might sign up for an expensive gym membership, believing that you'll be more committed in the future, but then you don't really follow through. Your future self isn't as on board with the plan as your past self believed it would be. As a related example, I'm chronically overcommitted because at every moment I assume that my future self is going to be less busy than I am now. And so I say yes to future invitations or obligations, like taking on big new projects or attending multiple social events. And when the time arrives, my future me wishes that my past me hadn't overcommitted. And more generally, we fall victim to lots of planning fallacies. We underestimate how long it's going to take to complete some task. You might think, cool, I can knock that thing out in a week. And then you find that it takes twice as long. And that happens because we typically fail to correctly predict all the possible setbacks and complexities that we'll run into in the future. My favorite example of a planning fallacy is with a gentleman named James Murray, who in 1878 set out to write the Oxford English Dictionary. And the idea was to capture all the words in the English-speaking world and give definitions for all of their various shades of meaning. And this seemed like a big undertaking, but not big enough that he couldn't complete it in a few years. So he worked on this for 36 years until he died, and then several editors took up the mantle after him. And the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary was finally completed 70 years after he began. He totally misapprehended the size of the project. And if I were he, I presumably would have done the same. So as a result of this sort of planning fallacy, we're constantly making decisions that our future selves are going to regret or disagree with. Why? It's not because we're idiots now, but instead because our circumstances and our preferences and our priorities are going to change over time. Okay, so let me zoom back out to the big picture. We are creatures who live and change through time, but we're yoked with this illusion that we are unchanging. And so we misremember our past and we work hard for future versions of ourselves who we assume will be like us, but they may not be. And by the way, there are all kinds of complex relationships between your future self and your past self through time. So it gets pretty crowded. Your past self says, oh, I'm not going to worry about my future self. And your future self looks back and says, what a jerk. Like when people make the decision in the short term to postpone their education or splurge on some overpriced thing. And then your future self thinks, dang, I wish I'd gone to that class or spent my money on something more meaningful or necessary. This comes up for many people in terms of retirement savings. People will make the decision to spend now rather than save for their future selves. They keep thinking, oh, I'll start saving later. But then as retirement approaches, your future self feels mad at your past self and wishes you had started saving earlier. And I suspect this is true anytime we choose instant gratification over long-term goals. Our future selves look back and they're mad about it. And all this highlights the challenge of balancing short-term desires with long-term outcomes. In other words, yourself in the moment now versus yourself in the future. So let's wrap up. In the next episode, part 2, we're going to dive deeper into all these paradoxes of the self by talking with my colleague, neuroscientist Mike Levin, who wrote a recent paper in which he pointed out that, quote, if we do not change, learning and growth is impossible. If we do change, does not the current self cease to exist in an important sense, end quote. So let's summarize where we got in this episode. We began by looking at the illusion of continuity, and we used the ancient thought experiment of the ship of Theseus, where one plank of the ship gets replaced at a time, and we can ask, is it still the ship of Theseus after every plank has been replaced? We looked at this question because we are always surfing on top of constant physical changes, and yet we perceive ourselves as consistent over time. The planks in Theseus's ship are the cells and molecules in your body. And this foregrounds the question about what makes you the same person over time. We ask the question of whether we can really say that memory is the thread holding identity together, because the truth is that memory is far from reliable. It's constantly being rewritten. And finally, we touched on a cognitive bias known as the end of history illusion, which is where we massively underestimate how much we're going to change in the future, even though we're aware that we've changed in the past. We tend to believe that our current tastes and values and personalities are going to remain consistent from here on out, even though we keep on changing throughout our lives. So you can't actually be your past self, but as we'll see in part 2 next week, we constantly try to reconstruct that person. We constantly try to revivify that past self based on the evidence provided by reinterpreting the clues that are left by them. In other words, the memories that are buried in the neural network. In this view, memories are like a message in a bottle thrown from your present self into the ocean for someone to find. And that someone is a future you who you don't necessarily know. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and to find further reading. Send me an email at podcast@eagleman.com with questions or discussion, and check out and subscribe to Inner Cosmos on YouTube for videos of each episode and to leave comments. Until next time, I'm David Eagleman, and this is Inner Cosmos.